It is the 9th of July, 1944, and the Normandy countryside smells of diesel, cordite, and something worse. Near the village of Caen, a 21-year-old private named Tom Durrant is lying on his stomach in the ruins of a hedgerow, barely breathing. 30 meters ahead of him, a German Panzer IV has stopped to scan the tree line. He can hear the engines idle, a low, mechanical grumble, and he can see the barrel of its 75mm main gun rotating with grotesque patience, searching for a target. Durrant does not have a rocket launcher. He does not have an anti-tank rifle, or a bazooka, or anything that might reasonably be described as elegant. What he has is a roughly 4.5-kilogram object that resembles, more than anything else, a medieval siege weapon crossed with a particularly stubborn piece of drainpipe. It is dirty, it is heavy, it takes enormous physical effort to cock, and at the ranges printed on its instruction card, it will reliably destroy the most powerful tanks the Wehrmacht can produce. It is called the projector, infantry, anti-tank. It is universally known as the Piat. Durrant squeezes the trigger. There is a loud, flat crack, less of an explosion than a concussive thud, and the Panzer IV erupts in a column of smoke and orange fire. The crew never get out. He will learn later that his section has destroyed 3 tanks that afternoon. The Piat will be carried by Allied infantry from Normandy to Berlin, through the winter counteroffensives of 1944 and the street fighting of the Rhine crossings, and it will account for a significant, if persistently debated, proportion of German armor destroyed on the Western Front. This is the story of how Britain came to develop one of the strangest, most impractical-looking, and yet genuinely effective infantry weapons of the Second World War. It is a story about failure, specifically about the catastrophic failure of every conventional solution, and about the particular genius that emerges when engineers are left with nowhere else to turn. It is also, in a very British way, a story about making something work despite itself. To understand why the Piat came to exist, it is necessary to understand the scale of the problem British infantry faced in the early years of the war, and how badly the existing tools were failing them. By the summer of 1940, it was obvious to anyone paying attention that the fundamental equation of ground warfare had changed. The German Blitzkrieg doctrine, combining armor, air support, and motorized infantry in rapid, decisive strikes, had rendered the static defensive lines of the First World War obsolete overnight. France had fallen in 46 days, Poland in 5 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped through Dunkirk in a flotilla of fishing boats and pleasure craft, leaving behind virtually all of its heavy equipment. The immediate question for the British Army was not how to win the war. It was how to survive long enough to try. Infantry needed a weapon they could carry, operate without support vehicles, and use at close range against moving armor. What they had was the boy's anti-tank rifle, a bolt-action weapon firing a 13.9mm round that weighed approximately 16 kilograms and delivered a recoil that soldiers described as being struck by a lorry door. Against the early, lightly armored German vehicles of 1939, the boys had been passably adequate. Against the Panzer IV, and worse, the Panzer III upgunned variants appearing in significant numbers by 1941, it was essentially useless. The round would simply bounce off the frontal armor as though it had been thrown by hand. There were grenades, of course. The number 74, nicknamed the sticky bomb, was a sphere of nitroglycerine encased in an adhesive stockinette covering, designed to be pressed against the hull of a tank and then pulled away by the soldier before it detonated. This required the soldier to be close enough to touch the tank. The logic was not widely admired. Battlefield accounts suggest that the adhesive worked with impressive efficiency on soldiers' uniforms, trouser legs, and anything else it contacted before or after the intended target. It was dangerous, unreliable, and required a level of proximity to the enemy that most soldiers found professionally inadvisable. The Northover projector, idea introduced in 1940, fired glass bottles of phosphorus incendiary material from a tube using black powder charges, and managed to combine significant limitations in range, accuracy, and safety into a single weapon. It was not intended to be a serious anti-tank solution so much as an indication that someone had tried. What was needed was something that could be operated by a single infantry soldier, could be carried across rough terrain without mechanical support, could penetrate at least 75 millimeters of armor at ranges of up to 100 meters, and could be manufactured quickly, cheaply, and in large numbers using materials that were available during a war economy. As of 1941, no such weapon existed in British service. The question was whether it could be made tihuer. The man who eventually solved the problem was not a weapons engineer in the conventional sense. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker was a somewhat idiosyncratic figure in the British military establishment, the kind of inventive amateur that the Army periodically produced and was never quite sure what to do with. He had already designed a weapon called the Blacker Bombard, a spigot mortar used in various forms throughout the war, and it was from this device that the core concept of the PIAT was adapted. The design work was carried out primarily at the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a title that managed simultaneously to be perfectly accurate and entirely inadequate to describe the urgency of the work being done there. The central insight behind the PIAT was to abandon the idea of a propellant charge driving around through a barrel, the conventional approach that required either a large, heavy weapon or a dangerous backblast that would reveal the firer's position instantly. Instead, the PIAT operated on a spigot principle. There was no barrel in the conventional sense. A heavy, spring-loaded rod, the spigot, was cocked back against an enormous spring that required approximately 90 kilograms of force to compress fully, roughly equivalent to lifting a grown adult off the ground using only the muscles in your thighs and lower back while lying flat. Once cocked, the weapon was loaded with a bomb that sat in a trough at the front of the device. The bomb itself was the most technically interesting component. It was a hollow charge projectile, sometimes called a shaped charge, based on principles first described by the American engineer Charles Munro in the 1880s, but only recently applied to anti-tank munitions with any systematic rigor. When the bomb struck its target, a copper-lined cavity at its tip focused the explosive detonation into a hypersonic jet of copper plasma, traveling at approximately 8 kilometers per second. This jet, barely wider than a pencil at its narrowest point, punched through armor plate not by brute force but by pressure so intense that the steel temporarily behaved like a liquid. At its rated penetration, the PIAT could punch through 102 millimeters of homogeneous armor plate at a standard angle of attack, which was sufficient for the sides and rear of virtually every German tank then in service, and adequate against the front armor of the Panzer IV and Stug 3 variants most commonly encountered. When the trigger was pulled, the spigot was released. It flew forward, struck a propellant cartridge embedded in the base of the bomb, fired the bomb forward, and, in theory, the recoil of this firing action recocked the spring automatically, ready for the next shot. In practice, this automatic recocking was reliable in good conditions and somewhat less reliable in mud, cold, and the other circumstances that characterized most theaters of the Second World War. The device was manufactured primarily by ICE and a network of subcontractors across the Midlands and north of England. The complete weapon measured approximately 97 centimeters in length and weighed 14.5 kilograms when unloaded. Heavy, but carryable by a single soldier. Each bomb weighed approximately 1.1 kilograms. Production figures remain partially classified, but estimates from post-war analysis suggest that something in the region of 115,000 units were manufactured between 1942 and 1945, with production accelerating significantly in the run-up to the Normandy landings. The PIAT first entered combat service in Tunisia in 1943, where it was used by British and Commonwealth infantry against German armor in the difficult terrain of the North African theater. Initial reports from field commanders were cautiously positive, which in military communication usually means considerable enthusiasm, and the weapon was deployed in significant numbers for the Sicily landings in July of that year. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, every British infantry section carried at least one Piat, and the weapon had accumulated a combat record that ranged from the quietly effective to the remarkable. A particular incident on June 13, 1944, deserves special attention. During fighting near Nory-on-Bessin, Company Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis, the only soldier to be awarded the Victoria Cross for actions on D-Day itself, used a Piat to neutralize a gun emplacement and covered the withdrawal of his company under heavy fire. His citation notes the Piat with something approaching matter-of-fact admiration. Most extraordinary of all was the action for which Lance Corporal John Fairfax received the Victoria Cross in Italy in May 1944, and, more famously, the action at the Wall River crossing in September 1944 during Operation Market Garden, where Sergeant John Baskyfield of the South Staffordshire Regiment continued firing his Piat until he was killed, having already been wounded and destroyed at least 2 German tanks and 2 armored vehicles. His posthumous Victoria Cross remains one of the most remarkable testimonies to what a single soldier with this peculiar weapon could achieve against odds that should have been impossible. The psychological effect on German armor crews was significant and well documented in captured interrogation reports. German tank commanders became increasingly reluctant to advance into built-up areas or through bocage terrain, precisely the conditions where a Piat could be used effectively at short range, partly because they knew that an enemy soldier could be lying behind a wall with a weapon that left almost no visual or acoustic signature until the bomb was already in flight. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is instructive to place the Piat against its contemporaries, because the comparison reveals something important about how different nations approached the same tactical problem with markedly different engineering philosophies. The American bazooka, formerly the M1 rocket launcher, was developed concurrently and first saw service in North Africa in 1942. It operated on an entirely different principle: a rocket-propelled shaped charge, electrically ignited, that left the weapons tube under its own power. The bazooka was lighter than the Piat at roughly 5.5 kilograms, simpler to operate, and produced no significant recoil. It was also, at 55 millimeters of armor penetration, substantially less powerful than the Piat's 102 millimeters. More significantly, it produced a visible backblast of flame and smoke that could extend nearly 2 meters behind the firer, making concealment after firing extremely difficult in many tactical situations. The German Panzer IV, the most widely used German anti-tank weapon by the latter stages of the war, was in some respects even simpler than the Piat, a disposable, single-shot, recoilless device that fired a large warhead with a penetration exceeding 140 millimeters. It was devastatingly effective, cheap to manufacture, and simple enough that it could be issued to poorly trained Volkssturm militia in the final months of the war. Its weakness was range. The early Panzerfaust 30 was effective only to approximately 30 meters, increasing to 60 meters in later variants. At those distances, a soldier advancing against armor was vulnerable to being run down, machine-gunned, or simply missed by a tank that maneuvered out of range. The Piat's effective range of 90 to 100 meters provided a significant margin of additional safety. The German Panzerschreck, developed after examination of captured American bazookas, essentially copied the rocket-propelled principle and added a larger caliber for improved penetration. It was effective and produced penetration comparable to the Piat, but shared the bazooka's backblast problem and required a 2-man crew for reliable operation. What distinguished the Piat was a particular combination of concealment, penetration, and versatility. Because it produced minimal flash and no backblast, a PIAT team could fire from inside a building, from behind a stone wall, or from deep in vegetation without immediately betraying their position. It could also be used as a crude light mortar, fired at a high angle against soft-skinned vehicles, troops in the open, or building entrances, a capability the bazooka and Panzerfaust largely lacked. Several post-war analyses noted that the PIAT's dual function made it especially valuable in the street-fighting conditions of Italy and Northwest Europe. Assessing the PIAT's actual impact on the outcome of the war requires the kind of precision that military history rarely allows. The British Army's post-war analysis estimated that PYAT fire accounted for approximately 7% of all German armor destroyed on the Western Front by British forces, a figure that sounds modest until one considers what that number represents in absolute terms. Against the total attrition of German tank strength throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe, 7% is an operationally significant contribution from a weapon carried by foot soldiers. More important, perhaps, was the tactical effect. The PIAT's presence forced German armor to behave differently. Tanks that might have advanced with confidence into a hedgerow or village instead slowed, screened themselves with infantry, and demanded reconnaissance before proceeding. This slowdown had cascading effects on German operational tempo at precisely the moments: the Falaise encirclement, the Battle of the Bulge's early hours, the Rhine crossings, when speed was most critical. The weapon's influence did not end in 1945. The spigot mortar principle that underpinned its design continued to be studied and adapted by weapons engineers in several countries during the early Cold War period, and the hollow charge principle itself became the cornerstone of virtually every infantry anti-tank system developed subsequently. Modern weapons such as the RPG series, the LAW, and the NLAW are separated from the PIAT by generations of engineering, but they inherit the same foundational insight, that a single infantry soldier, properly equipped, can destroy a main battle tank. Surviving Piats can be seen in a number of collections, most notably at the Imperial War Museum in London, the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset, and the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, a reminder that the weapon served across the entire Commonwealth of forces. They are frequently described by those encountering them for the first time as surprisingly large, unexpectedly heavy, and not what one imagines when thinking of a weapon that changed the course of armored warfare. Return, for a moment, to that hedgerow outside Caen. The Panzer IV is burning. The crew did not escape. A 21-year-old private is lying in the mud, still alive, breathing in the smell of cordite and whatever else burning armor produces. He is holding a weapon that some German officers, when they first captured examples in North Africa and Tunisia, reportedly found so crude in construction that they assumed it must be some kind of emergency improvisation, a stopgap that would surely be replaced by something more refined. They were wrong. It was never replaced. It served until the war's end, was used in the Korean conflict by Commonwealth forces, and remained in limited service with some nations into the 1950s. What the Germans had mistaken for crudeness was, in fact, economy of means. The PIAT did not do anything it did not need to do. It did not try to be elegant. It did not try to be comfortable. It recocked itself in theory and mostly in practice, and when it did not, the loader recocked it manually in approximately 5 seconds. It fired a shaped charge that could defeat any tank in the German inventory when aimed correctly, and it left no backblast, no visible flame, no immediate indicator of exactly where the firer was standing. 6 Victoria Crosses were awarded to soldiers firing a PIAT, 6 of the highest military honor in the Commonwealth, in a war that produced 181 such awards in total, went to men lying in the dirt with a drainpipe, squeezing a trigger and hoping the spring had held. Think about that number. 6. Not one man compensating for the failure of his equipment through extraordinary courage. 6 men, 6 separate occasions, where the combination of personal valor and this blunt, awkward instrument was sufficient to change the immediate course of a battle. The Piat weighed about as much as a child's bicycle. It required the upper body strength of a laborer to cock from a prone position. It looked, as one historian noted with some affection, like something a moderately talented plumber might assemble on a slow afternoon. The Germans thought it was a joke. It destroyed 40 tanks in a single week during the Normandy campaign, according to the most conservative available estimates, from records that are themselves incomplete and partially obscured by the fog of operational reporting. On the days and in the places where those tanks burned, the men who fired the weapon did not appear to find it particularly funny. Sometimes the ugliest solution is also the correct one. The British Army, in the desperate improvisational crucible of 1941, produced a weapon that was cheap, effective, versatile, and made of approximately the same materials as a decent workshop vise. It gave ordinary infantry the ability to threaten the most powerful ground weapons of the age, and it did so at a unit cost that allowed it to be distributed to every section that might face armor. The Piat was not beautiful. It was not comfortable. It was not elegant. But on a sunlit afternoon in a Normandy hedgerow, when the Panzer's engine was still and the smoke was rising, and the 21-year-old private was still breathing, it was, without question, enough.